They threw him out of a boardroom in New York, right in front of his wife, as if he were nothing more than a man who did not belong. No one understood why he stayed silent. No one questioned why he did not fight back. What they did not know was that just hours later, the man they dismissed would be holding the power to decide their fate. And when the truth finally surfaced, there would be no place left to hide. The glass elevator doors slid shut in front of Daniel Reed, leaving him standing alone in the cold marble lobby of a Manhattan financial tower, as if the world had just decided he no longer belonged with a single press of a button. The security guard in the black suit did not even bother to lower his voice. "People like you don't belong here." Daniel heard every word, not because it was loud, but because the contempt behind it was heavy enough to press against his chest. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not beg. The worn jacket at his shoulders, the scuffed shoes, the faded leather briefcase made him look exactly like a man out of place in a building where money was measured in hundreds of millions of dollars per minute. Around him, expensive suits flowed past like water around an invisible stone. No one looked at him for more than a second, except Sarah. She stood a few steps away, fingers gripping her handbag, blue eyes flickering with shame and helpless anger. Sarah Sterling, the only daughter of the Sterling family of Los Angeles, had just walked out of a board meeting her husband had never been meant to enter. She wanted to speak, but the guard's cold stare and the curious glances nearby crushed the words before they could form. Daniel turned toward her and gave a slight shake of his head. A small gesture, but enough. "Don't say anything." He smiled. Calm, almost impossibly calm, as if being thrown out of this place were nothing more than a minor detail in a much longer day. If only they knew. If they knew that the man they had just dismissed once signed agreements that shook Silicon Valley to its core. If they knew that the name Daniel Reed had appeared on contracts worth enough to buy the very building that had just rejected him. But they did not know, and he had no intention of telling them. The Sterling family had been looking at Daniel that way for a long time. Mr. Sterling called him a burden. Lucas Sterling, the ambitious cousin, called him Sarah's greatest mistake. At lavish Los Angeles parties, Daniel was always the one standing at the edge, holding a glass of water, listening to conversations about power and money as if they belonged to another universe. They talked about markets, about deals, about who would inherit what next. And when Daniel stayed silent, they assumed it was because he did not understand. None of them ever asked why a man labeled a failure could remain so composed under humiliation. None of them recognized that his silence was not weakness, it was discipline. The kind forged in rooms where life-changing decisions were made with a single nod. Daniel stepped outside into the Manhattan cold. Wind cut across his face as the city roared around him. Horns, engines, a rhythm that waited for no one. He paused on the stone steps and looked up at the glass towers reflecting a gray sky. Sarah followed, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't think they would do this." Daniel turned back to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's fine." His voice was low and steady, more promise than comfort. Inside his pocket, his phone vibrated. He did not look at it right away. He already knew who was calling, and he knew what it meant. The board had begun to shift. The people who turned their backs on him today would soon be forced to look up. He walked on, disappearing into the crowd, no one noticing that in the middle of Manhattan, there was a man who had just been underestimated more than anyone else, and who also happened to hold enough power to rewrite the future of every person who had dismissed him. And somewhere far beyond the lights of New York, a past Daniel had buried deep was beginning to stir, ready to pull him back onto a path he once swore he would never walk again. Daniel Reed had once stood in a very different place, not beneath the cold lights of Manhattan, and not under the dismissive stares of the Sterling family, but in the heart of Silicon Valley, where ideas were valued more than gold, and a single mistake could bring an empire down overnight. Back then, the name Daniel Reed was not whispered behind closed doors. It was spoken in secured boardrooms, printed on plans locked behind layers of encryption, and carried through late-night phone calls that decided the fate of entire companies. He never needed to raise his voice. He only had to sit, listen, and ask the right question at the right moment. The room would fall silent. He was a builder, not a showman, not a man hungry for cameras or headlines. Daniel created systems, strategies, frameworks that allowed massive organizations to run with surgical precision. When everything worked, he stepped back. When a crisis hit, he stepped forward, fixed it, and disappeared again. That was what made him dangerous. The final meeting took place in a glass room overlooking the valley. The same men who once called him a visionary now looked at him with measured distance. They wanted more profit, more control. Shortcuts Daniel refused to take. He stood slowly and said there were lines that could not be crossed, that growth at any cost would eventually destroy everything they had built. No one argued with him, but no one stood beside him either. The offer placed on the table that day was never meant to be signed. It was a verdict wrapped in polite language. Daniel could walk away quietly. No lawsuits, no public battles, no more appearances. In return, he would keep his true network, the loyalty that mattered, and time. Time no one else could touch. He accepted, not because he had lost, but because he understood this game required patience. A few followed him, not many. An engineer resigned without explanation. A financial advisor vanished from every contact list overnight. They did not ask Daniel what the plan was. They said only one thing: when you are ready, we will be there. Daniel carried that silence with him into his marriage with Sarah, a marriage the Sterling family saw as a compromise, a temporary arrangement. They saw a man without status, without visible assets, without obvious ambition. They did not see the calls he ignored. They did not see the accounts he never touched. They did not see an entire network asleep waiting for his signal. He allowed himself to be underestimated. Every insult, every smirk, every look of pity was noted, cataloged like data in a long-term equation. Daniel understood something they did not. Real power never needs to announce itself. It only needs to exist. That night, as Manhattan sank into a wash of amber light, the phone in his pocket vibrated again. This time he stopped. The voice on the other end did not waste words. They were moving against Sarah. The board was shifting. A major deal was about to be used to push her out of the game. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Years of silence, sacrifice, and buried promises suddenly felt insignificant next to one truth: Sarah. He opened his eyes and watched the traffic flow like arteries through the city. The game he once walked away from was calling him back. And this time, Daniel Reed had no intention of standing on the sidelines any longer. Daniel Reed did not return to the game with an explosion. He came back quietly, with movements that were precise, deliberate, and almost impossible to trace. It began as coincidence. An obscure investment fund surfaced in New York and acquired a minority stake in a struggling tech firm. No famous name, no press release, just a transaction small enough to escape attention. Then, in Silicon Valley, another company received what was described as strategic capital from a newly formed entity. Same pattern, same silence. No one noticed the pieces being set into place. Daniel sat in a modest rented apartment, staring at an aging laptop. Data streamed across the screen, names, numbers, relationships layered over one another. To anyone else, it would have looked like chaos. To Daniel, it was a map of power slowly revealing itself. He did not need to control everything. He only needed to place his hand in the right spot. The first call came from the West Coast, a familiar voice he had not heard in years. The former partner did not ask if Daniel was sure. He asked when they were starting. Daniel answered with 2 words: right now. In Los Angeles, inside Sterling headquarters, the atmosphere began to shift. Lucas Sterling felt it first. A deal he believed was locked suddenly stalled. A longtime partner requested revisions, citing concerns that had never existed before. Responses that once came instantly now arrived late, vague, evasive. Lucas frowned, unsettled, without understanding what he was facing. Sarah sensed the change differently. Polite but firm emails began appearing in her inbox, requesting her presence at additional strategy meetings. People who once dismissed her now listened when she spoke. No one explained why, and Daniel, as always, said nothing. He remained the same husband who showed up on time, poured coffee each morning, asked how her day would be. His calm unsettled her. She did not know that while she slept, Daniel had signed decisions powerful enough to redirect the course of an entire board. One evening, Daniel stood by the window, watching the endless flow of Manhattan traffic below. His phone vibrated. A name appeared on the screen, one that once commanded deference with a single mention. Now that person was waiting for Daniel's approval. He did not answer immediately. He let it ring for a few more seconds, a quiet reminder that the balance had shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice remained low and steady. "We proceed as planned." On the other end of the line, a powerful chief executive understood that his career had just been decided by a single sentence. There was no argument, no negotiation, only cold acceptance. Within a single day, a major name was removed from leadership. The market buzzed, but no one traced the source. The media called it an unexpected restructuring. Daniel called it a necessary move. He knew he was drawing closer to the center of the storm. Every move carried consequences. Every decision pulled him further from the promise he once made to never return. But some promises were meant to be broken, especially when the woman he loved was standing on the edge. Sarah began to look at Daniel differently, not with suspicion, but with a quiet sense that there was something about the man beside her she had never truly understood. And far away, inside the polished boardrooms of Los Angeles, a family meeting was being scheduled, one where everything Daniel had prepared in silence would finally begin to surface. The next chapter was waiting, and this time, the light would no longer shine only on those standing center stage. The Sterling boardroom fell into silence before anyone could speak. The large screen behind the table flickered to life, not with the familiar company logo, but with a stark financial alert announcing a market shift that had happened only minutes earlier. No one had prepared for this. No one had imagined that an internal meeting in Los Angeles would begin with the sensation that the ground beneath them had quietly tilted. Sarah Sterling sat upright, her fingers interlaced, knuckles tight. She could feel the eyes on her, open, unfiltered, unforgiving. Lucas Sterling broke the silence, for his voice was smooth, confident, carrying the practiced ease of a man who believed control was already his. He spoke about figures, about exposure, about a deal that, according to him, Sarah had handled without sufficient caution. Every word was carefully chosen, never an outright accusation, yet sharp enough to plant doubt. Slow nods followed around the table. Agreement, distance, judgment. Sarah stood. She did not shake. Her voice carried across the room, steady and clear, though she stood alone. She defended her decision, spoke of long-term vision, of commitments already verified. When she finished, there was no applause, only a heavier silence than before. Lucas leaned forward and asked a single question. Who is backing this investment? The room held its breath. At that exact moment, the screen behind them changed. No one touched the controls. A live financial dashboard appeared, numbers updating in real time. Then came the confirmation, unmistakable, undeniable. The capital was real. The commitment was real. And the guarantor was not a name anyone in that room had anticipated. Murmurs erupted like a breaking wave. Chairs scraped back. One board member raised a hand to their mouth. Lucas turned sharply toward the screen, the smile on his face freezing mid-breath. Sarah felt her heart race, but this time it was not fear. Something else rose in its place, disorienting and powerful. She did not know who had done this. She only knew that the balance of power in the room had shifted, swiftly and without appeal. The meeting ended earlier than planned. There was no formal vote. There was no need. Those who had questioned Sarah moments before now approached her with outstretched hands, their voices noticeably warmer. Praise followed, late but enthusiastic. Lucas left the room without saying a word. Within hours, the news spread beyond the building. The media called it an unexpected turning point. The market reacted favorably. Sarah Sterling's name appeared across financial outlets, paired with language she had never been granted before. That evening, Sarah returned home early. The apartment was quiet, bathed in soft amber light. Daniel was there, standing by the window, as if he had never left. He turned when he heard her, offering the same calm smile he always did. "Everything okay?" he asked. Sarah looked at him longer than usual. She wanted to say so many things, to ask, to understand. Instead, she nodded. Fine. Daniel did not press further, but something deep and shadowed passed through his eyes, like a tide retreating from shore, leaving smooth sand behind while concealing the force beneath. Elsewhere in the city, Lucas Sterling clenched his phone, reading the same name over and over in a confidential report. A name never mentioned publicly, yet powerful enough to tell him the game no longer belonged to him. And in the quiet aftermath of it all, Sarah began to realize a truth that would not let her sleep. The person who had saved her that day was not a distant force. He was living under the same roof. Sarah Sterling's victory did not bring the relief she had expected. In the days following the board meeting, her phone never stopped vibrating. Congratulations, private invitations, smiles that had once been distant now felt overly warm. People spoke of her vision, her leadership, the future of the Sterling Group under a new generation. Sarah listened, responded with practiced grace, yet inside her a quiet emptiness began to grow. Because amid all the praise, one thing remained unchanged. Daniel stayed silent. He was still the man who came home on time, hung his coat by the door, asked if she had eaten. The same calm eyes, the same steady voice, as if the world outside had not shifted at all. That contrast unsettled her, not because she distrusted him, but because she did not understand him. At Sterling headquarters, the atmosphere had turned sharp. Lucas Sterling no longer attacked Sarah openly, but his silence carried more weight than his former jabs. He arrived early, stayed late, met privately with board members behind closed doors. Emails were sent, then quietly recalled. Sarah could feel an undercurrent forming beneath the polished surface. Daniel sensed it too. Familiar names began resurfacing in confidential briefings. People who once swore loyalty now tested the waters, probing, listening. Some believed Daniel had already revealed himself. Others assumed he was merely a front for a larger force. Daniel corrected no one. He let them expose themselves in their own time. One evening, while Sarah was tied up in meetings, Daniel met an old contact in a small cafe tucked away from the city's bright core. The man did not waste words. He said there were people willing to pay a very high price to learn who Daniel truly was. Loyalty, like everything else, could be bought. Daniel met his gaze and replied with a single sentence. Some things are not for sale. The man fell silent. Then he nodded, not convinced, but aware that a line had been drawn. That night, Sarah returned home later than usual. The apartment was dark, save for a soft light in the kitchen. Daniel sat there, hands folded, as if he had been waiting. Sarah stopped short, her heart racing for reasons she could not explain. "Have you ever wondered," she said slowly, "how well we actually know each other?" Daniel looked up. His eyes did not turn away, but he did not answer. "Everything is happening too fast," Sarah continued. "Someone saved me. Someone is behind all of this. And the only person who doesn't seem surprised is you." The silence stretched, not explosive, not hostile, but deep enough to make the room feel heavy. Daniel stood and moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Some truths," he said quietly, "only matter when they are told at the right time." Sarah swallowed. And if that time never comes? Daniel held her gaze. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that looked like regret. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside the small apartment, an invisible thread was being pulled tight, between loyalty and betrayal, between love and secrets left unnamed. And somewhere in the shadows, Lucas Sterling was preparing his next move, one that would force Daniel to choose, not just between power and silence, but between staying hidden and stepping into the light. They believed the danger had passed. They believed the man they underestimated had already lost. What they didn't realize was that he was about to walk back in. New York sat beneath a pale wash of sunlight, the kind that made everything look normal enough to be dangerous. Sarah Sterling stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her collar, but her fingers trembled despite her effort to steady them. A nameless sense of unease had followed her through the night, lingering like a warning she could not quite hear. At Sterling Group headquarters, the air was tight with tension. An emergency internal meeting had been called without notice, without an agenda. The moment Sarah stepped into the boardroom, she knew something was wrong. Familiar faces sat around the table, people who had smiled at her only days ago. Now their eyes avoided hers or fixed on her with calculated distance. Lucas Sterling sat at the head of the table. He smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. The smile felt like velvet wrapped around a blade. "Sarah," he said slowly, "today we need to clarify a few things. For the future of the company." Folders slid across the table. Contracts, reports, carefully edited internal emails. Each piece had been arranged to tell a single story, that Sarah had manipulated authority, that outside forces were influencing her decisions, that she lacked transparency. She listened, heart pounding, yet her expression remained controlled. She understood this was not a discussion. It was a trial. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah stood. Her voice did not shake, but every word carried weight. "If you intend to accuse me of misconduct," she said, "then present real evidence, not fragments arranged to fit your conclusion." Lucas shrugged. He did not need truth on his side. He only needed doubt. Then the door opened. Daniel walked in. No announcement, no urgency, just a man in a simple suit, so ordinary he seemed out of place in a room built on power. A few people laughed quietly. Others froze where they sat. Lucas frowned. He had not invited this man. Daniel stopped just behind Sarah. He did not look at her right away. His gaze moved across the room, measuring faces, reading reactions, calm, composed, as if he had spent a lifetime in rooms like this. "I apologize for the interruption," Daniel said evenly, "but it appears you are discussing me." The room went still. Lucas laughed, louder this time. "You? And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Daniel placed a thin folder on the table. Gently, precisely, the holder of delegated voting rights, the controller of the strategic investment flows over the past 6 months, and the individual responsible for the temporary restructuring of Sterling Group Capital. Whispers rippled across the room. People leaned in, scanning names, connecting dots. Faces drained of color. Lucas pushed back his chair. "That is impossible. You are nobody." Only then did Daniel turn to Sarah. For a brief moment his eyes softened, carrying something close to apology. Then he faced Lucas again. "Nobody," he repeated, "perhaps because I never felt the need to introduce myself." He spoke his name clearly, followed by the names of firms, funds, and acquisitions he had quietly orchestrated over the years. No pride, no drama, just facts placed where they could no longer be ignored. Silence swallowed the room. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. Every doubt she had carried, every unanswered question from the past 3 years, snapped into place. The truth was larger, heavier, more frightening than anything she had imagined. Daniel had lived in the shadows not because he was powerless, but because he had chosen restraint. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Lucas was forced into temporary withdrawal. Those who had turned against Sarah moments earlier suddenly found urgent reasons to remain quiet. When the room finally emptied, only Sarah and Daniel remained. She looked at him, anger and hurt tangled with disbelief. "How long?" she asked softly. "Were you planning to hide all of this from me?" Daniel did not look away. "Until I was certain," he said, "that I could protect you without making you lose yourself." Sarah turned aside. She needed time, but she knew something else just as clearly. From this moment on, there was no returning to the life they had before. The truth was out, and the final chapter, where every choice would demand a price, was already waiting. The morning arrived more gently than Sarah had expected. New York woke to its familiar rhythm. Crowded streets, coffee shops opening their doors, people moving with purpose toward lives that did not pause for anyone. The city had no idea that only hours earlier, a powerful empire had quietly shifted its center of gravity. Sarah stood by the apartment window, watching traffic flow below. She had barely slept, not from fear, but from the weight of everything she now had to reorder in her mind. The truth was out. There were no layers left to hide behind. Daniel was no longer the ordinary man she once believed him to be. Yet he was not a stranger either. He was still the man who had stood beside her through humiliation, through rooms filled with judgmental eyes, through moments when she had been forced to stand alone. Daniel stepped out of the bedroom, carrying the same calm presence he always had. There was no visible triumph, no display of dominance, just a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for far too long. Sarah turned to him. This time her eyes held no panic, only caution and a quiet, honest sadness. She understood now that Daniel's power had never appeared overnight. It had always been there, concealed beneath deliberate silence. They talked longer than they ever had before, not to argue, but to understand. Daniel spoke of the years spent outside the light, of choices no one witnessed, of the cost of holding control without the right to explain it. Sarah listened, not as a wife placed in the shadow of her husband, but as an equal. At Sterling Group, change unfolded silently but decisively. Lucas Sterling stepped back from every position of influence. Those who had accused Sarah days earlier suddenly found reasons to remain discreet. No one questioned where true authority now rested, and yet Daniel never appeared again. He did not need to. The game was already over. Sarah returned to the boardroom with a different presence, not because she leaned on her husband's power, but because she now stood firmly on her own choices. What had happened proved something no one had believed before. She was not someone to be protected. She was someone strong enough to be trusted. That evening, as the city lights came on, Sarah and Daniel stood together on the balcony. They did not speak much. No dramatic promises were made. Both of them understood the road ahead would not be easy. Truth always leaves marks. But at least they were no longer walking in the shadow of misunderstanding. Some people are born into power and choose silence. Some are underestimated, not because they are weak, but because they are patient enough to wait for the right moment. And some victories are not about forcing the world to bow, but about protecting the values that money can never buy. The lesson left behind was clear. Never dismiss someone simply because they do not seek attention. Never measure a person's worth by appearances or titles. Sometimes the one who seems invisible is the one shaping the entire game. And real power does not come from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. If this story made you think, leave a comment and share your perspective. Hit like if you believe in the strength of patience and quiet resilience. And don't forget to subscribe to Untold Journey Stories, where we continue to tell the stories of those who were underestimated, yet carried journeys that forced the world to look again.